The room already had a rhythm before he walked in. Leather gloves tapping heavy bags, shoes scraping across the wood floor. Low conversations drifting between bursts of laughter. It was the kind of afternoon training session where everyone believed they knew exactly who belonged there and who didn't. Then the door opened. A slim man stepped inside. Quiet. Observant, not dressed like the others. No dramatic entrance, no announcement. For a moment, nobody reacted. Then someone recognized him. A chuckle moved across the room. Wait, that's him? Another voice, louder this time. Hey, movie guy, show us something real. 6 seconds later, nobody in that hall was laughing, and the silence that followed stayed with them for years. The training hall sat on the second floor of an old brick building in downtown Los Angeles. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, cutting long, pale lines across the wooden floor. The place smelled like canvas, sweat, and the faint rubber scent of old mats. It was busy that day. Heavy bags swung slowly after rounds of punches. Two wrestlers argued about grips near the far wall. Someone practiced roundhouse kicks against a thick shield, while another group leaned against the lockers, talking louder than necessary. Every room like this develops its own atmosphere, its own hierarchy. Here, experience spoke first. The fighters who trained regularly carried themselves with a certain casual authority. Their stances were relaxed, their movements confident. They belonged here. Newcomers were easy to spot, which is why the door opening drew attention almost immediately. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet creak. A slender man stepped inside. He paused near the entrance for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the light. Dark hair. Simple training clothes, nothing flashy. No entourage, no attempt to draw attention. At first, most people barely looked twice. But recognition travels fast in a room full of competitive personalities. One of the younger fighters squinted toward the door, then nudged the man beside him. Hey, isn't that Bruce Lee? The second man glanced over his shoulder. He stared for a second longer than necessary. Then he smiled. Yeah, he muttered. Movie guy. The phrase carried just enough volume to travel. A few more heads turned. Bruce walked slowly along the edge of the floor, watching the training without interrupting anyone. His posture looked relaxed, but his attention moved constantly studying footwork, timing, how people carried their weight. He had that habit everywhere he went. Observation first. Always. Meanwhile, the whispers had started. Some people looked curious, others amused. A few seemed mildly annoyed by the sudden distraction. In places like this, reputation mattered, but it had to be the right kind of reputation. A man throwing combinations at a heavy bag stopped long enough to wipe sweat from his forehead. He leaned slightly toward the group near the lockers. So that's the famous Bruce Lee? Someone shrugged. Yeah, from those kung fu movies. Another fighter laughed quietly. Figures. The mood shifted slowly, not hostile, not welcoming. Something in between. The kind of atmosphere where people start waiting for something to happen. Bruce seemed completely unaffected. He stepped closer to the open training space and set his small gym bag against the wall. One of the instructors nodded politely from across the room. Bruce returned the nod. No words, no introduction, just presence. Across the floor, a much larger fighter had begun watching him closely. The man was broad-shouldered, thick through the chest, the kind of athlete whose power showed even when he stood still. He had been sparring earlier and still wore taped wrists. He looked Bruce Lee up and down once. Then again. A grin crept across his face. He turned to the guys standing beside him. That's him? Someone nodded. The big fighter chuckled softly. Well, he said, rolling his shoulders as if warming up again. Let's see if he can actually fight. Places like that training hall had rules nobody ever wrote down. You learned them by watching. The loudest voices usually belonged to the strongest fighters, the ones who had proven themselves during sparring rounds, guys who had been there long enough to build a reputation. When they spoke, people listened. When they stepped onto the mat, space opened for them. That afternoon was no different. Near the center of the room, two boxers were finishing a round. Their gloves slapped rhythmically against focus mitts, while a small crowd watched with casual interest. Nearby, a pair of judo students worked through throws, the thud of bodies hitting the mat blending into the room's background noise. Bruce Lee remained near the wall for a moment, quietly observing. He didn't stretch, didn't shadowbox, didn't announce himself. He simply watched. That alone stood out. Most fighters entering a room like this wanted to establish something immediately. Confidence, toughness, style. They moved loudly, hit the bags hard, or joined a sparring circle without hesitation. Bruce did none of that. His stillness almost felt out of place. A few people noticed. Across the floor, the broad-shouldered fighter who had been watching earlier leaned against a support beam. His name was Carl, and in this gym his reputation was well understood. He had boxed amateur for years and carried the kind of natural strength that made opponents cautious before the first punch even landed. Carl folded his arms and studied Bruce again. "Looks smaller in person," he muttered. One of his training partners smirked. "You expected something else?" "I don't know," Carl replied. "For all the hype, I thought he'd look like more of a fighter." A few nearby men laughed quietly. Bruce seemed unaware of the conversation, though his eyes occasionally drifted in their direction. Not confrontational, just aware. He finally stepped forward toward the open mat area. The room reacted in small ways. Conversation slowed. A few fighters turned their bodies slightly, watching without pretending they weren't. Carl straightened from the beam. "Maybe he's here to film something," someone joked, "or promote another movie." That line got a few louder laughs. Bruce stopped a few feet inside the training space and rolled his shoulders gently, loosening them. His movements were economical, no wasted energy. The instructor from earlier approached halfway across the floor. "You're welcome to train if you'd like," the man said politely. Bruce gave a small nod. "Thank you." His voice was calm, almost quiet enough to disappear into the room. Carl watched the exchange, the grin slowly returning. He pushed away from the beam and stepped forward, drawing the attention of several people nearby. This was how things usually worked here. Someone new arrived, someone established decided to test them. Carl cracked his neck to one side, then the other. The room was beginning to sense it now. Something was about to happen. Bruce turned slightly, noticing Carl approaching through the cluster of fighters. Carl stopped a few feet away. For a moment he just looked at Bruce Lee. Then he shook his head with a half laugh. "Man," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "You're that movie fighter, right?" The room didn't fall silent right away, but the volume shifted. Conversations faded into half-whispers. Gloves stopped hitting the bags. Even the pair practicing throws paused long enough to glance over. Carl stood there with his hands on his hips, studying Bruce like someone inspecting a product that didn't quite match the advertisement. Up close, the size difference was obvious. Carl had at least 40 pounds on him, maybe more. Thick arms, heavy shoulders, the build of a man used to overpowering opponents. Bruce looked smaller, lean, almost light. Carl tilted his head. "So, you're Bruce Lee?" It wasn't really a question. Bruce met his eyes calmly. "Yes." No defensive tone. No pride either. Just a simple acknowledgement. Carl chuckled and looked over his shoulder at the small crowd gathering behind him. "Guys," he said, gesturing toward Bruce, "we've got a celebrity in the gym today." A few people laughed, not cruelly, at least not yet. But the energy had shifted into something familiar, competitive curiosity mixed with amusement. One of the younger fighters leaned forward. "Is he going to do those movie kicks?" Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, the flying ones." More laughter. Bruce didn't react. He stood with his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture loose but balanced, weight evenly distributed. Anyone who had trained seriously might have noticed the subtle readiness in his stance. Most people there didn't. Carl stepped a little closer. "Don't get me wrong," he said, still smiling. "Those movies are fun, real entertaining." He paused just long enough to let the next words land. "But that stuff's choreography, right?" A few heads nodded behind him. Carl spread his hands slightly. "So I'm curious." He leaned in a little, voice louder now. "Can you actually fight?" That line drew the biggest laugh yet. Someone near the lockers slapped the metal door with his palm, enjoying the moment. Bruce's expression didn't change. For a second, he simply studied Carl's face, not aggressively, just observing the man the same way he had observed the room earlier. Carl mistook the quiet for hesitation. He grinned wider. "Come on," he said. "You walk into a fighter's gym looking like that, people are going to wonder." He gestured toward the open space on the mat. The crowd naturally widened the circle. Carl's voice rose just enough to carry across the room. "Show us something real." The phrase hung there. A few people repeated it softly under their breath. Someone laughed again, though it sounded less confident now that the moment had arrived. Bruce remained still. Then he slowly took one step forward. The movement was small, but it changed the atmosphere immediately. Carl cracked his knuckles. "Well?" Bruce tilted his head slightly. His voice was calm when he spoke. "You sure?" Carl blinked once. Then he laughed again. "Oh, I'm sure." He stepped onto the mat fully now, rolling his shoulders loose as the circle around them widened. Behind him, someone muttered, "This should be interesting." Bruce Lee didn't answer. He simply raised his hands. Not high, just enough. And suddenly the room felt different. The circle around them widened without anyone saying a word. It happened naturally. Fighters stepped back from the mat, creating space the way people always do when a sparring match begins. Some leaned against the walls. Others crouched near the edge of the floor, arms resting on their knees. The room had gone strangely quiet. A few moments earlier there had been laughter. Now there was mostly anticipation. Carl bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, loosening up the way boxers often do before a round. His confidence hadn't changed. If anything, the attention seemed to energize him. He rolled his neck once more and raised his fists. Across from him, Bruce Lee stood almost motionless. His stance looked casual at first glance, but if someone had studied closely, they would have noticed the subtle details. His weight rested slightly forward. His hands floated comfortably between chest and chin level. His lead foot angled toward Carl, ready to move in any direction without delay. Nothing theatrical, nothing exaggerated, just balance. Carl glanced around at the spectators. "Relax," he said with a grin. "I'm not going to hurt the movie star." A few people chuckled again, though it sounded quieter now. Bruce's eyes stayed on Carl. Not aggressive, not tense, just focused. Carl noticed the gaze and tilted his head. "You planning to attack?" he said. "Or are we waiting for the director to yell action?" That earned another small laugh. Bruce inhaled slowly through his nose. Then he spoke. His voice was calm enough that people near the back leaned forward to hear it. "You can start." Carl blinked. "You serious?" Bruce nodded once. Carl shrugged. "All right." He stepped closer, testing the distance between them. The kind of casual probing fighters use before committing to a real move. Bruce didn't shift backward. He didn't flinch. Carl circled slightly to the left. Bruce adjusted his stance with a tiny pivot of his lead foot. Nothing dramatic, just awareness. One of the spectators whispered to his friend beside him, "Why does it feel weirdly tense all of a sudden?" His friend didn't answer. Carl exhaled and lifted his guard higher now. The grin remained, but his movements had sharpened. Even confident fighters feel a small spark of caution once a real exchange becomes possible. "Okay," Carl said. He flicked a quick testing jab toward Bruce's shoulder. Bruce's head moved an inch. The punch missed cleanly. Carl smirked. Good reflexes. He reset his stance. then leaned forward slightly, preparing to come in with more commitment this time. Bruce Lee watched the shift in Carl's weight, the tightening of his shoulders, the subtle loading of his back leg. The room held its breath. Carl stepped in. And the next 6 seconds would become the only thing anyone remembered about that afternoon. Carl stepped back half a pace after the first missed jab, not because he felt threatened, because he was recalibrating. Fighters do that instinctively. A quick test, a small probe. See how the other person reacts. Measure distance, measure timing. Bruce Lee hadn't done anything dramatic. He had simply moved his head, barely. But the ease of it lingered in Carl's mind for a moment. Carl bounced again, loosening his shoulders. "All right," he said, breathing out through his nose. "You're quick." The compliment wasn't really respect. It was the kind of remark people make before deciding to increase pressure. Behind them, the circle of spectators tightened. Nobody laughed now. Several of the more experienced fighters leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. Something about the posture Bruce held was beginning to register with them. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. Carl rolled his wrists, testing the tape around them. "Don't worry," he added with a grin, loud enough for the room to hear. "I'll keep it friendly." Bruce didn't answer. He stood almost exactly where he had been standing before. His lead hand floated loosely in front of him, fingers relaxed rather than clenched into a tight fist. Carl noticed that. "Not even making a fist?" he said. Bruce tilted his head slightly. "Depends. On what?" Bruce's eyes remained steady. "On what you do." Carl snorted. "Okay then." He stepped forward again, this time with clearer intention. His left foot slid across the mat, closing distance quickly. His shoulders rotated, preparing to send a heavier punch behind the motion. It wasn't reckless. Carl knew how to fight, but he expected resistance. Expected Bruce to back away. Expected at least a moment of hesitation. Instead, Bruce did something unusual. He stepped slightly forward, into the space. That small decision confused Carl's rhythm for half a second. Not enough to stop him, but enough to shift the timing he had already committed to. Carl's right hand started to move. Behind him, someone murmured quietly, "Wait." Another fighter beside him whispered. He stepped in. Carl's punch accelerated. His weight transferred forward. Bruce Lee watched the motion the way a chess player watches a piece being moved across the board. Distance, angle, timing, all aligning in the space between two heartbeats. Carl believed he was about to land the first real strike. The room believed the same. Bruce moved first, not with a dramatic wind-up, not with a flashy kick, just a short, precise shift of his body. And suddenly Carl was no longer controlling the moment. The 6 seconds had begun. Carl's right hand came forward with real commitment this time. The punch carried his weight behind its shoulders turning, hips driving through the motion. It wasn't sloppy. It wasn't wild. The man knew how to throw a punch. For most opponents in that room, it would have been enough to force them backward. Bruce Lee did the opposite. As Carl's punch traveled forward, Bruce stepped in again, not recklessly, just enough to cut the distance before the strike could fully extend. That single step collapsed Carl's reach. The punch passed across Bruce's shoulder instead of landing square. Before Carl could retract his arm, Bruce's lead hand snapped forward. Short, direct, two quick strikes landed against Carl's center line, fast enough that the sound reached the room before most eyes processed the movement. A sharp pop against the chest. Then another. Carl's breath hitched. His body reacted instinctively, tightening around the sudden shock. Bruce had already shifted again. His rear hand shot forward in a straight line, stopping just short of Carl's face, close enough that the air moved against his skin. Carl froze. Not because he was hurt, because he realized how exposed he had just become. Bruce stepped to the side, redirecting Carl's forward momentum with a light, guiding push against his shoulder. Carl's balance broke. His lead foot slid awkwardly across the mat as he tried to recover. Bruce's leg moved next. A quick sweep against Carl's supporting ankle, nothing violent, just perfectly timed. Carl's body tipped sideways. His arms flared outward in an attempt to stabilize. Too late. The big fighter hit the mat with a dull thud, landing on his side and elbow before rolling slightly onto his back. The entire exchange had happened so quickly that several people in the room hadn't even finished inhaling. 6 seconds. Maybe less. Bruce stepped back immediately. No follow-up strike. No celebration. He simply returned to the same relaxed posture he had started with, hands lowering calmly to his sides. Carl blinked up at the ceiling. For a moment he looked genuinely confused, like someone waking from a brief nap. Around the circle, nobody spoke. A man near the lockers replayed the exchange in his mind, trying to understand the sequence of movements. He stepped inside, he muttered quietly. Another fighter whispered, "I didn't even see the second strike." Carl rolled onto one elbow, still catching his breath. He wasn't injured, but the suddenness of the fall had shaken something deeper than his balance. Bruce waited silently a few feet away, not looming, not pressing the advantage, just watching. Carl looked up at him, and for the first time since the challenge began, the grin was gone. For a few seconds, the room didn't react at all. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows a knockout. Nobody rushed forward, nobody shouted, no one even clapped. It was quieter than that. The kind of pause that happens when people are trying to make sense of something their eyes weren't prepared to see. Carl remained on one elbow, breathing slowly through his nose. Across the mat, Bruce Lee stood exactly where he had stepped back. His posture had already relaxed again. Shoulders loose, hands lowered, the same calm presence he carried when he first walked into the room. Nothing about him suggested he had just finished an exchange. Near the wall, one of the younger fighters blinked repeatedly. "Wait," he whispered to the man beside him. "What just happened?" His friend didn't answer right away. He was still replaying the moment in his mind. The step forward, the sudden strikes, the shift of balance, then Carl hitting the mat. "It was 3 moves," the man muttered finally. "No," someone else said quietly from behind them. 4. Another fighter shook his head. "I didn't even see the second one." Across the circle, the instructor who had greeted Bruce earlier folded his arms and watched carefully. His eyes had narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition. He had seen controlled fighters before. But the speed of that exchange was unusual. Carl pushed himself up slowly, first onto his knees, then onto his feet. The room instinctively stepped back a little farther, giving him space. He brushed his palms across his shorts, clearing the dust from the mat. No one laughed now. The earlier energy, the teasing, the joking, the casual arrogance had drained out of the room completely. Carl rolled his shoulders once, testing his balance. Then he looked at Bruce. Really looked this time. Bruce met his gaze calmly. There was no challenge in his expression, no hint of "I told you so." Just steady eye contact. Carl exhaled slowly through his nose. Behind him, someone murmured, "Man, that was fast." Another voice answered, "Too fast." The words spread through the room in fragments. "Did you see?" He stepped inside the sweep. "Where did the second hit land?" But no one raised their voice. The volume stayed low, almost cautious. Carl flexed his fingers once, then twice. Finally, he gave a small shake of his head, as if clearing away the last of his confusion. Bruce hadn't moved. The mat between them remained open. Carl studied him for another long second, and the entire room waited to see what he would do next. Carl stood there for a moment, breathing slowly. The room waited. A few minutes earlier, the atmosphere had been playful, almost cocky, the kind of energy that shows up when a group of fighters believes they already understand the outcome of something. Now the mood was different. quieter, more careful. Carl rubbed the side of his jaw with his knuckles, not because he had been hit there, but because it gave him a second to think. Fighters sometimes do that after a sudden exchange buying time, while their pride and their instincts try to settle into the same place. Across from him, Bruce Lee remained relaxed. He hadn't stepped forward again, hadn't raised his hands, hadn't even shifted his stance much. He simply stood there, waiting. Carl let out a slow breath and walked forward a step. Not aggressively this time, just enough to close the distance between them. "You move fast," he said. The words carried across the quiet room. Bruce gave a small nod. "Speed helps." Carl huffed a quiet laugh under his breath. "Yeah, I noticed." He glanced down briefly at the mat where he had landed moments earlier. The memory of the exchange was already replaying itself in his mind, trying to understand exactly where the balance had disappeared. Then he looked back up. "You stepped inside my punch." Bruce nodded again. Carl shook his head slightly, almost impressed. "That's not how most people react." "No," Bruce replied calmly. "It usually surprises them." A few of the fighters around the circle exchanged glances. The earlier teasing had completely disappeared now. What remained was curiosity. Respect beginning to form. Carl rolled his shoulders again and finally extended his hand. "All right," he said. "That was real." Bruce looked at the offered hand for a moment, then reached out and shook it. The handshake was simple, no dramatic gesture. But the entire room felt the shift. Carl stepped back and glanced toward the others watching. "Well," he said with a crooked grin returning to his face, "guess the movie guy can fight." That line drew a small ripple of laughter. But this time the laughter sounded different, not mocking, acknowledging. Bruce bent slightly to pick up the small gym bag he had placed against the wall earlier. He slung the strap over his shoulder. The fighters nearby parted automatically as he walked past them toward the edge of the mat. One of the younger students spoke quietly as Bruce passed. "Hey, Mr. Lee?" Bruce paused and turned his head slightly. "Yes?" The young fighter hesitated, then asked the question everyone in the room had been thinking. "How long have you been training like that?" Bruce considered the question for a moment. Then he gave a small, thoughtful smile. Bruce held the young fighter's gaze for a moment. The room was still listening, not loudly, not leaning in the way people do when they expect a speech. It was quieter than that, just a tension hanging in the air. Bruce considered the question again. "How long have you been training like that?" He shifted the strap of his gym bag slightly on his shoulder. "A long time," he said. His tone was calm, almost conversational. Then he added something that sounded less like an answer and more like a small observation. "But not always the same way." The young fighter frowned slightly, trying to understand what that meant. Bruce continued. "At first, I learned styles, systems, rules." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Later, I started removing things." Carl, still standing near the center of the mat, tilted his head. "Removing things?" he asked. Bruce nodded. "Movements that were slow, reactions that were predictable." He made a small gesture with his hand, tracing an invisible line through the air. "If a strike travels in a straight line, you don't need 3 movements to deal with it." A few of the more experienced fighters in the room exchanged thoughtful glances. That idea landed differently, now that they had seen it in action. Bruce looked around the hall once more. Heavy bags swayed gently from the earlier training. The sunlight through the tall windows had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the mat. The same room. But the atmosphere had changed. Carl stepped forward again, folding his arms loosely. "You weren't trying to show off," he said. Bruce shook his head. "No." Carl nodded slowly. "I can tell." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Carl chuckled quietly. 6 seconds, he said. Bruce didn't respond to that. He simply adjusted the strap of his bag again. Near the wall, one of the fighters whispered to another. "I thought he was just a movie star." His friend shook his head. Not anymore. Bruce walked toward the door. No dramatic exit. No final bow. Just a quiet step back into the hallway outside. The door closed softly behind him. Inside the training hall, the fighters remained where they were for several seconds, the moment still settling into memory. Years later, some of them would describe that afternoon in slightly different ways. Some remembered the speed. Others remembered the timing. But almost everyone agreed on one detail. Before Bruce Lee walked into that room, people had been laughing. After those 6 seconds, nobody laughed again.